you think you're clicking on like a normal Wikipedia page, right?
Hmm.
Like a promising athlete or businessman. But
Yeah.
it turns out to be Richard Grissom, a serial killer.
Yeah.
And we're going to do a deep dive into him today. We've got excerpts from his Wikipedia page detailing his crimes and trials. And the mystery around his victims makes you wonder, how well can we ever truly know anyone, really?
I think what's fascinating here is you see this contrast between Grissom's seemingly normal upbringing and the nature of his crimes. He was adopted into a military family, moved around the U.S., got decent grades, played football. On the surface, there's nothing that would scream future serial
Yeah,
killer.
it's hard to reconcile those two sides of a person. His first crime in 1977, the murder of Hazel Meeker,
Hmm.
his elderly neighbor. He's only 16 at the time.
Yeah, and that attack was so brutal. And it wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. He bludgeoned her with a railroad spike. And then he was found after the crime, wearing only one shoe, which is just really bizarre. It points to some kind of psychological disturbance beyond your average teenage issues.
Not your average teenage rebellion.
Yeah.
I mean, were there any signs
Hmm.
that people missed? What could be pushed him to do something so horrific?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Because you have to consider adolescent psychology in cases like this. Was there some kind of trauma in his past? Or some mental health issues that went unaddressed? Or was it a lot of different factors? I mean, these are questions that criminologists and psychologists deal with all the time.
Yeah, it's almost like you're trying to put together a puzzle,
Yeah.
but you're missing half the pieces.
Exactly. And with Grissom, it gets even more complex. Because after serving time for that first murder, he was released and actually made an effort to build a normal life. He went to Kansas State University, joined the track team. He even got a nickname, Rockman, because of his frequent falls.
Wait, Rockman, what's that all about?
It sounds funny, but apparently he would trip and fall during races. But he excelled at other sports, too, like racquetball and softball. And he even had a job. You know, it seems like he's trying to turn things around.
Well, go on.
There are these red flags that keep showing up. He's convicted of theft in 1982. Then he steals a car in 1984 and ends up back in prison. It's like this pattern of behavior that escalates. Even though he's trying for a stable life, it really makes you think about rehabilitation.
So even with the effort, there was this underlying darkness that kept pulling him back.
It seems that way, and it gets even darker in 1989.
This is when the Johnson County murders start, right?
Yes. Grissom was in a relationship with Terry Renee Manas, and she was found murdered in her condo. And soon after, 3 young women vanish within 3 weeks. Joan Marie Butler, Christine Rush, and Teresa Brown. It's a scary escalation of his activity.
And this is what really makes him a serial killer. 3 women gone without a trace. I mean, that's terrifying.
Absolutely. And the fact that 3 of the bodies were never found adds to the mystery and the anguish. I mean, for the families, not knowing, the lack of closure, it must be so difficult.
I can't even imagine. It's just an open wound that never heals.
Exactly. And it's during the investigation of the disappearances that forensic evidence becomes so important, even without the bodies.
So how do you even start to put a case together, especially when someone is trying so hard to hide what they did?
That's where you combine traditional detective work with new forensic science. And you see both with Grissom.
Like what kind of forensics?
Well, first, they got security footage of Grissom using Joan Butler's bank card. That's a big deal right there. And then they found a storage locker rented under Teresa Brown. But it was linked back to Grissom. The worst part, they found a bloody knife and credit cards from the missing women in his car.
Wow. Sounds like they were getting close.
Yeah, and with new technology, they could use hair and DNA analysis, which helped their case even more. They used all that, plus witness statements and his history of violence, to try and get the jury to see he was guilty.
But without the bodies, it must be hard to convict. Did his lawyers try to use that?
Oh, yeah. They said, look, no bodies, no proof they're even dead, let alone that Grissom did it. The prosecution had to rely on details and experts to explain what Grissom did and why.
This has been hard to prove.
Yeah. And this case was happening during a big debate about the death penalty in Kansas, so it was a big political deal, too.
It's crazy how one case can cause so much debate.
It's true. It makes people think about justice, punishment, and how the legal system works.
So what happened at the trial?
He was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison. But even with that, there are still so many questions. especially about where the bodies are.
It feels incomplete, no peace for the families, no real closure.
Exactly, and that lack of closure is what haunts this case. Grissom won't say anything about the bodies. He could give the family some peace, but he refuses.
That has got to be so frustrating for them, knowing he knows, but won't tell.
It is. And there was more. A ransom note in 1989. Turned out to be fake, but it gave the families false hope. Then in 1999, they searched a landfill because of a tip. But they didn't find anything. It's like every time they get close to an answer, it just hurts them again.
I can't imagine what that does to them emotionally.
It's awful. And then there are other things about his life in prison that have come out, weird glimpses into his mind. A man who can do such terrible things.
Like what?
Well, for example, he was part of an internet pen pal group, talking to people outside prison. Then a local paper accidentally wished him happy birthday, which caused a huge issue. Oh, and he sent a note to a prison guard. These details may seem small, but they show he's still living, still interacting with the world, while his victims' families are stuck with his silence and the mystery.
It's a stark difference. It really makes you think about the impact of these crimes, not just on the victims, but on everyone around them.
You're right. It reminds us that violent crime has a huge impact on the victims, of course, but on their families, their communities, and even the whole justice system.
So after all this, the trials, the unanswered questions, what does it all mean? What can we take away from Richard Grissom's story? I don't know. It's hard. I mean, yeah, legally there's an ending. He was convicted. He's in prison. But there are just so many questions. The bodies are still out there. The families have no answers. Can you really have justice in a situation like this?
It's a question everyone has to answer themselves, I think. There's no easy answer. But what I see in Grissom's story is hope, even in the midst of tragedy.
Hope. It seems hard to find hope in a case this dark.
I know what you mean. But think about the families. They haven't given up on finding their loved ones, on bringing them home. They've been through so much. Years of waiting, dead ends, false hope. But they keep searching. That's what I mean by the human spirit being so strong.
It is powerful. Even in the darkest times, there's still hope.
Exactly. And I think this case shows us something else, too, about how people can be both good and evil. Grissom seems normal, right? He was an athlete, went to college, had a job. But under all that was this darkness, this potential for violence that just took over.
It's scary to think about. But we never really know what's going on inside someone's head, even people we think we know.
That's right, which is why we need to be careful, to trust our gut feelings, and say something if things feel off. We got to look out for each other, build communities where everyone feels safe, and hopefully prevent these kinds of things from happening.
That's something we can all do. So to wrap up our deep dive on Richard Grissom, what's one last thing you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Don't forget about the people involved, the victims, their families, everyone affected by this violence. The best way to honor them is to keep looking for justice, support those who are hurting, and work towards a world where these horrible things don't happen as much.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And to everyone listening, if you want to know more about this case, there's a lot of information online. News articles, court documents, even interviews with people involved. This is a story that's still going on. They're still looking for those missing people.
As you learn more, remember to be kind, be aware, and try to understand all the reasons why these things happen.
This has been a really interesting look at a case that makes you think about human nature, about justice, and about trying to find closure. Thanks for listening, everyone.